Imagine a man once worth billions, reduced to fumbling with credit cards at a gas station. The kind of man who once commanded entire boardrooms with a single glance, who had CEOs begging for partnerships and politicians lining up for donations, now standing under the flickering glow of a dusty convenience store ceiling. His hands trembled as he slid one sleek black card after another through the machine. Declined. Another try. Declined. The tiny screen seemed to scream the word. Each. Beep like a public announcement of his downfall. People waiting in line leaned forward, smirking, their eyes sharp with judgment. The cashier sighed, impatient, her hand tapping against the counter as if she had more important lives to attend to. The laughter started small, just a snicker from the back of the line, but it spread quickly, like wildfire feeding on humiliation. A man in a baseball cap muttered just loud enough, "Look at this guy. Mercedes parked outside, probably rented. Fancy watch, probably fake. Can't even pay for gas." Whispers rippled like knives across his back. Each one dug in deeper than the last. For a man who had lived in a world where perception was everything, the public spectacle was unbearable, and yet, what no one in that station, not one of those smirking faces could have possibly known, was that this wasn't just some rich man who'd lost his way or gambled too much on risky deals. No. This was Ethan Cole. The Ethan Cole. The architect of a $3 billion empire built from nothing more than code, vision, and relentless work. The man whose name once symbolized innovation, possibility, power. But what had brought him here wasn't bankruptcy in the traditional sense. It wasn't reckless spending or bad business moves. It was something far more dangerous. Ethan had stumbled across a secret powerful enough to bring governments to their knees, to expose systems that weren't meant to be seen by the public eye. Files, transactions, whispers buried deep in encrypted servers that revealed corruption so vast it could alter the balance of entire nations. And for daring to look, for daring to even imagine pulling back the curtain, he had been marked. His assets frozen, his reputation shredded, his empire dismantled piece by piece, not by accident but by design. A message written in the most brutal ink: stay silent or lose everything. And if silence wasn't enough, perhaps his dignity would be next. That's why he was here. Not because he was broke in the conventional sense, but because invisible hands had pushed him to his knees. Each declined card was a reminder that his enemies weren't just powerful. They were merciless. Every beep of rejection was their voice echoing in his head. We own you now. But fate has a strange sense of humor. Just when the world had gathered in a small gas station to watch a giant collapse, something unexpected happened. Something no one in that line could have predicted. Least of all Ethan himself. Standing a few feet behind him, barely tall enough to see over the counter, were two little girls clutching a pink purse. Their hair tied with ribbons, their shoes scuffed from play, their eyes wide with the innocence of those who hadn't yet learned to mock a man in pain. Inside that purse was exactly $15.60, mostly coins, carefully counted and saved from allowances and chores. They glanced at each other with unspoken courage, and one of them tightened her grip on the purse. "We can help him," she whispered to her sister, her voice trembling yet fierce. And in that single moment, everything shifted. The sneers softened. The laughter faltered. No one laughed at them because kindness, real, uncalculated kindness, has a way of silencing cruelty. They stepped forward, their small hands trembling as they opened the purse, and Ethan felt his world pause. He had been mocked, betrayed, stripped of power, but in those young eyes he saw something he hadn't seen in months. Hope. What they did. Next, with nothing more than a handful of coins and the courage to stand against ridicule, would ignite a firestorm that no one in that gas station could have foreseen. A spark had just been lit, and it would burn far brighter than any empire Ethan had ever built. As Ethan tried card after card, laughter rippled louder. Every declined beep sounded like a courtroom verdict, announcing to the world that he was no longer who he used to be. His pulse quickened, his throat tightened, and shame crawled up his spine like a cold hand. The humiliation was unbearable. People were leaning on counters, enjoying the spectacle like a street performance. Strangers were whispering about his car, his suit, his watch. The cashier rolled her eyes, muttering about time wasters. It felt like every corner of the room had turned into a mirror reflecting his downfall. But then, two voices, small, but steady, cut through the mockery like a bell-piercing fog. "We can help him." The entire room shifted. Conversations died. The laughter collapsed into stunned silence. Heads turned toward the source of the sound, and there they were. Two little girls, no older than 8, standing side by side as if the world itself had chosen them to speak, Faith and Joy. Identical twins, with eyes that carried both innocence and bravery. They clutched a pink purse with faded cartoon stickers peeling from its surface. Their hair was tied with mismatched ribbons, their clothes simple, yet their presence radiated something that instantly quieted every cynical soul in that gas station. Their mother, standing a few steps behind, panicked. Her voice cracked with alarm. "Girls, get back here!" She grabbed at the air, desperate to pull them away from the spotlight, away from danger, away from judgment. But they didn't move. Their little feet stayed planted on the tiled floor, as steady as any soldier on a battlefield. Faith tightened her grip on the purse and stepped forward, her chin lifted with quiet determination. "We have 1560, she said, her voice trembling. At first, then gaining strength. "It's not much, but Grandma always says, when you can help, you do." The room fell silent. The silence was heavy, not awkward, but sacred, like the hush that falls before a prayer. All the ridicule, the smirks, the mocking whispers that had poisoned the air seconds ago dissolved into nothingness. Every eye was fixed on those two girls. A cashier who had been smirking moments ago froze mid-sentence, her mouth half open. The man in the baseball cap who had sneered earlier looked down at his shoes, ashamed. For weeks, Ethan had endured betrayal like a slow death. Boardroom allies turned enemies. Executives who once groveled for his approval abandoned him when the storm came. Men he had raised from obscurity into power left him stranded when the knives appeared. He had been mocked by tabloids, attacked by rivals, and deserted by friends who used to call him brother. Every betrayal had hollowed him out until he felt like nothing more than an empty shell of the man who once commanded billions. But in that single moment, two children, two strangers with nothing to gain, showed him more humanity than the entire corporate world ever had. Their courage was unpolished, their generosity uncalculated, and yet it cut through him with more force than any business deal he had ever signed. Ethan dropped to one knee, lowering himself until his eyes were level with theirs. His hands shook, not from fear this time, but from something he hadn't felt in months: hope. His eyes glistened as he searched for the right words, words that wouldn't crush the beauty of the moment. "What are your names?" he whispered, his voice cracked but reverent. Faith looked him squarely in the eye. "Faith," she said, clear and steady. Joy smiled shyly, stepping half a pace closer. "Joy." Ethan's breath caught, the weight of their names hit him like a revelation. Faith, Joy. As if the universe itself had sent them as messengers, carrying the very things he thought he had lost forever. A tear slipped down his cheek before he could stop it. He leaned closer, his voice breaking with gratitude, but soft enough that only they could hear. "Hope and love, that's what you've given me." The twins smiled, not fully understanding the depth of his words, but feeling the sincerity. Behind them, they pressed the purse into his hands, the coins inside clinking like tiny bells of salvation. What the crowd didn't realize, what none of them could possibly fathom, was that this act of kindness had just flipped a switch inside. Ethan Cole, a man who held secrets powerful enough to shake nations, had just been given a reason to fight again. Not for power, not for revenge, but because two little girls reminded him that goodness still existed, and goodness was worth protecting. In that gas station, beneath buzzing fluorescent lights, with the smell of gasoline heavy in the air, the spark of a revolution was quietly born. The humiliation spread online within hours. The incident at the gas station, something Ethan had hoped would dissolve into the obscurity of strangers' memories, became fuel for a merciless digital wildfire. Hashtags trended within minutes. Gas station billionaire, broke but bougie, declined dynasty. Twitter threads dissected his fall with glee, Instagram reels looped the moment his card was rejected, and TikTok creators choreographed dances mocking his misfortune. Memes flooded the internet, each crueler than the last, his face photoshopped onto empty wallets, his luxury car edited into a shopping cart, his name twisted into a punchline. What should have been a private moment of humiliation was now public property. And yet Ethan didn't care about the laughter or the memes. He had grown used to being ridiculed since his empire had collapsed, and public opinion had long turned against him. They could mock his suit, his watch, his empty wallet. None of that pierced him anymore. What did pierce him, what broke through the numb shell he had built around himself, was the sight of those two little girls, Faith and Joy, being dragged into the storm. Their kindness had been real, pure, and selfless, yet the internet twisted it into cruelty. People joked about charity from children, turning the girls' generosity into a meme template. Their faces, blurred and pixelated by some, exposed by others, floated across screens around the world, and Ethan felt a sickness in his gut, knowing that the purity of that moment was now being defiled for entertainment. At 10:43 p.m., as he sat alone in the dim light of a cheap motel room, his phone buzzed. The sound was sharp, urgent, like the crack of a whip in the silence. He reached for it, expecting maybe another journalist or a mocking message from an old acquaintance. But the screen displayed a text that froze his blood. Nice disappearing act, Ethan. But now the whole world's watching. Maybe you should accept that some secrets are too dangerous for one man. J.K. The initials burned into his vision. J.K., Jonathan Kane, his ex-partner, his brother in arms for 15 years, the man he had trusted more than anyone else, and the man who had gutted him, stripped his company from him, and left him to bleed out under the weight of betrayal. Jonathan wasn't satisfied with stealing the empire they had built together. He wasn't satisfied with erasing Ethan's name from the company walls, the patents, the contracts. Now Jonathan wanted to erase Ethan himself. The message was a declaration. Jonathan was behind the frozen accounts, the digital campaign, the orchestrated collapse of Ethan's reputation. But the cruelty wasn't in the confirmation of betrayal. It was in the casual tone, the mocking ease with which Jonathan dismissed Ethan's pain. Before Ethan could even finish rereading it, another buzz. A second message appeared. This one cut deeper than any knife. I heard about the girls. Would be a shame if something happened to their family. Because of you. The words didn't just sting. They ignited terror. For the first time in weeks, Ethan's fear wasn't for himself. It was for Faith and Joy. Two children who had stepped into his nightmare without understanding what shadows they had crossed. Two girls who had seen him as a human when the rest of the world treated him as a joke. Now they were in danger, not because of their kindness, but because of him. Realization hit like a blow to the chest. This wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't about empires or egos or who owned the patents. Jonathan had drawn a line that Ethan couldn't ignore. It was no longer just personal. Innocent lives had been dragged into the battlefield. And for Ethan, that changed everything. In that moment, staring at the glowing screen in the darkness, he understood. This wasn't about surviving his own downfall anymore. It was about protecting two innocent children who had unknowingly become targets in a war they couldn't even comprehend. And Jonathan Kane had just made the worst mistake of his life, because Ethan Cole was no longer fighting for himself. He was fighting for them. Jonathan thought Ethan was broken. To the world, that seemed true. They saw a man stripped of his empire, reduced to fumbling for gas money while strangers filmed his humiliation. They saw a once untouchable billionaire mocked in hashtags and memes. They saw decline, failure, and disgrace. But what Jonathan didn't know, what no one knew, was that Ethan had been playing a longer game. He had spent the last 3 months not hiding in shame, but quietly building something far more dangerous than his former empire, a digital dead man's switch, every document, every recording, every piece of evidence he had accumulated against, Jonathan and the shadowy figures who had enabled him was encrypted, copied, and spread across secure servers in multiple countries. It was a time bomb with no wires, no explosives, but with the power to set the world on fire. Ethan had planned it meticulously. If anything happened to him, if he disappeared, if he died, even if he lost access to his systems, the files would automatically unlock and flood into the inboxes of hundreds of journalists, watchdog organizations, and government officials worldwide. These weren't rumors or whispers. They were undeniable proof. Corrupt contracts signed in boardrooms where politicians turned a blind eye. Offshore accounts filled with laundered money. Private conversations caught on tape where Jonathan and his allies spoke of manipulating entire markets. If the dead man's switch was triggered, careers would crumble, governments would fall, and Jonathan Kane's empire would be reduced to ashes. But Ethan had not built this arsenal to destroy Jonathan. He had built it to protect himself. And now, with Faith and Joy's lives at stake, the arsenal's purpose changed. For the first time, Ethan was ready not just to defend, but to strike. With the twins unknowingly caught in the crossfire, Ethan shifted into war mode. The humiliation he had endured burned into focus, sharpening his mind into something steel-hard and relentless. He started by quietly securing Faith and Joy's world. Their school, a modest brick building with faded paint and creaky doors, suddenly received anonymous funding for a complete overhaul of its security. Cameras were upgraded, entrances reinforced, and background checks tightened. To outsiders, it looked like a stroke of good fortune for an underfunded institution. To Ethan, it was the first line of defense. He went further. Using cutouts and shell accounts, he established long-term college scholarships for every student in their class. It was a gesture wrapped in secrecy, but it had purpose. If Jonathan's people began poking around, they would find themselves lost in a web of legitimate philanthropic activity. The twins wouldn't stand out as special. They'd be hidden in plain sight among dozens of others whose futures had suddenly brightened. Meanwhile, Ethan activated a dormant network he had been cultivating long before his fall. Engineers who had once worked under him and still owed their careers to his mentorship. Hackers who respected him for exposing corruption in the tech industry years ago. Journalists whose careers had been saved when Ethan leaked documents to protect them from lawsuits. Whistleblowers who had trusted Ethan with their darkest secrets and had seen him keep his word. One by one, he reached out through encrypted channels, assembling a silent army bound not by money but by loyalty and shared conviction. It wasn't just defense, it was preparation. For every move Jonathan made, Ethan wanted 3 counter-moves ready. And though the world thought of him now as a beggar, Ethan was already building a fortress of people, tools, and information. Meanwhile, Jonathan's campaign grew bolder, more arrogant with every passing day. The smear machine didn't rest. Fake news sites ran endless hit pieces about Ethan's reckless lifestyle and hidden debts. Doctored memes showed him living in alleys, begging for spare change, riding a bicycle with flat tires while his old company's stock soared. Talk shows invited analysts to laugh at his downfall, while late-night comedians made him their favorite punchline. The billionaire beggar became a cultural phenomenon, a shorthand for hubris, greed, and failure. The mockery spread so wide that even people who had never heard of Ethan Cole before knew the caricature Jonathan had crafted. But Ethan didn't flinch. Every insult, every meme, every broadcast was more fuel for the counterstrike he was planning. He documented it all, not to protect his ego, but to illustrate the extent of Jonathan's manipulations. Every smear was evidence, every lie, a breadcrumb leading back to the web Jonathan had spun, and through it all, Ethan's resolve hardened. He could forgive the theft of billions. He could forgive the mockery, the betrayal, even the loss of his legacy. But Jonathan had crossed the one line that Ethan Cole could never allow anyone to cross. He had threatened children. That act transformed the game. This was no longer a battle for reputation or wealth. It was a war, and Ethan was ready to fight it on Jonathan's terms, or burn everything to the ground if it meant Faith and Joy would never be touched. And deep down, a part of Ethan almost hoped Jonathan would make the next move. Because then, the dead man's switch wouldn't just be a weapon, it would be justice. 3 weeks later, the world woke up to headlines that shook not just the internet, but entire governments. Screens lit up across time zones, from glowing morning news tickers in New York to buzzing midnight alerts in Tokyo. The same phrase repeated, bold and undeniable. Tech giant exposed illegal surveillance of 200 million Americans. It was the kind of revelation that couldn't be contained. It wasn't rumor or speculation. It was evidence. Millions of leaked files poured out in waves. Journalists scrambled to piece it together, but the public didn't need interpretation. The documents spoke for themselves. Signed contracts between Jonathan Kane's corporation and shadowy government agencies revealed the sale of private data harvested from ordinary citizens without consent. Spreadsheets showed bank transfers worth billions, routed through offshore havens. More damning still were the audio recordings. In one, Jonathan's voice was unmistakable, dripping with arrogance as he mocked the very people whose lives he had violated. And then came the recording that froze the nation in horror, Jonathan threatening the safety of 2 children to intimidate Ethan. It was no longer business corruption. It was cruelty in its purest form, undeniable and unforgivable. Markets reacted. First, stock prices tied to Jonathan's empire plummeted within hours, triggering automatic trading halts. Investors scrambled to salvage what little remained, but the collapse was unstoppable. Then came the FBI, storming corporate offices with armed teams, while news helicopters circled overhead, beaming the raids live to millions. Employees in suits and heels walked out in single-file lines, their faces pale as agents carted away boxes of seized hard drives and files. Protesters gathered outside, chanting, holding signs with Jonathan's name crossed out in red. Online, the fury was volcanic. Expose Kane trended worldwide within minutes, followed by Protect the Innocent and Faith and Joy. Ordinary citizens who had once laughed at Ethan's humiliation now recognized the bigger picture. He hadn't fallen. He had fought back. And his evidence hadn't just taken down a corrupt billionaire, it had revealed the rot at the intersection of corporate greed and government power. For Jonathan Kane, it was a reckoning he had never imagined. His name was plastered across screens, not as a visionary leader, but as the architect of betrayal. And though his lawyers scrambled, no statement could erase the sound of his own voice threatening children. It was over. His empire wasn't crumbling. It had already turned to dust. That evening, as the dust of scandal settled into shock, 2 unlikely faces appeared on national television. Faces that would become symbols of a new kind of courage. Faith and Joy, sitting nervously beside their mother, blinked under the bright studio lights. Cameras zoomed in on their small hands clasped together, their shoes barely touching the ground beneath the chairs. They were not celebrities, nor heirs to fortune. They were simply 2 children who had acted on instinct, guided by a lesson their grandmother had instilled in them. Kindness matters, even when the world doesn't. The interviewer, a well-known journalist struggling to maintain composure, leaned forward. "Faith, Joy," she said softly. "Why did you help a man you didn't know?" Faith, her voice timid yet steady, answered, "We just wanted to help. Grandma says kindness can change the world." The words, simple as they were, struck like lightning across the audience. Social media lit up instantly. Quotes were shared, etched into digital posters, and turned into hashtags. Kindness can change trended within the hour. Joy, not to be overshadowed by her twin, spoke next. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of innocence and wisdom, carried a weight that silenced the studio. "Bad people are just people who forgot how to be good," she said earnestly. "Maybe they'll remember now." For a moment, even the anchor lost her words. There was no spin, no politics, no media framing. It was truth, raw and unpolished, from a child who believed it. 68 million people watched that broadcast live. By the next morning, the clip had reached hundreds of millions. In offices, people cried at their desks. In classrooms, teachers replayed the interview to show children the meaning of courage. In households across the world, the twins' words became dinner table conversations, sparking debates about morality, greed, and the power of small acts of kindness. The nation, bruised by revelations of corruption, suddenly found itself moved by the pure conviction of two girls too young to understand the weight of their own actions. Faith and Joy didn't just humanize the scandal, they redefined it. They weren't victims caught in the storm. They were lights cutting through it, proving that even in the darkest battles, innocence could lead the way. And Ethan? For the first time in months, he smiled. Not the weary, hollow smile of survival, but a real one, alive with meaning. He had fought Jonathan Kane with weapons of truth, and he had won. But in that victory, he had uncovered something greater than revenge. He had discovered purpose. With the empire of lies dismantled, Ethan poured his resources, connections, and experience into something new. The Faith and Joy Foundation. Unlike the corporations that had devoured lives for profit, his foundation existed to protect the vulnerable. Its mission was clear: support whistleblowers who risked everything to expose corruption, provide safe havens for families caught in corporate crossfire, and ensure that the next generation grew up with the tools to resist abuse of power. Within weeks, it attracted global attention. Donations flooded in. Volunteers signed up by the thousands. Lawyers, engineers, activists, and teachers all aligned themselves with a vision that had begun with two little girls offering $15.60 at a gas station. Jonathan Kane sat in a prison cell by then, awaiting trial on charges so extensive the docket stretched hundreds of pages. Stripped of luxury, power, and allies, he had nothing left but his thoughts. And those thoughts tormented him. For all his billions, all his influence, and all his schemes, he had been undone not by another titan of industry, but by the unshakable kindness of two children. They had shown more courage in 5 minutes than he had in his entire life. That truth gnawed at him more than any prison sentence ever could. As for Ethan, his empire of money was gone, but in its place he built something far stronger, an empire of trust, hope, and resilience. And in the quiet of his new office, surrounded, not by greed but by purpose, he understood a truth worth more than every fortune he had ever held. When everything is stripped away, the greatest power isn't money or influence. It's the ability to protect innocence, to turn kindness into a revolution, and to honor those moments when humanity shines brighter than corruption ever could. If this story moved you, subscribe now, because sometimes the smallest acts spark the biggest changes.